Hey there, Dangar here. I was just filming the trim tilt relay video, but I realised I bought a couple of the wrong relays, so I'm going to film that next week instead. But what I'm going to do now is film another vid on changing the oil seals on the prop shaft of an outboard gearbox. I have done a video in the past on changing the oil seals around a prop shaft. We did that what's sort of considered the correct way by pulling the bearing carrier out. But today I'm going to show you a bit of a hack way that I think is actually quite effective, and certainly maybe your only option if you can't get the bearing carrier out, if it's really corroded, and maybe you don't have a pulley, you don't have the right tools. So it's worth knowing this way is possible and what to look out for. I'm also going to show you a bit of a neat trick for replacing the oil seals with some maybe you get from an engineering store or an automotive store rather than buying the marine ones. So it's just something to be aware that you've got that option if you need to as well. First thing I'm going to do is drain the oil. I can't remember where this gearbox even came from, to be honest with you, so I'm just going to drain the oil out if it has any, and then we'll get started. Sitting like this, we can almost guarantee this oil is going to track along this skeg and end up outside the pan, but you know, we'll do our best. Not too bad. So that's pretty clean oil. I've got a funny feeling I'd prep this one. Here are the old oil seals between the prop shaft here and the casing here. Wrapped around here, which is a relatively harmless place for it to be, but you can see there's still some fishing line here, and getting fishing line wrapped around your propeller is pretty much the most common way to damage these seals. They do wear out with time anyway, because they are constantly rubbing against the turning shaft, but it's fishing line like that that's going to damage them. Now, those of you who subscribe will have seen one of the previous videos where I undo these two bolts and with a lot of huffing and puffing pull this bearing carrier out, and that is the textbook way to change these oil seals, no doubt about it. I've since purchased the Yamaha tool for pulling this, so I no longer have to use my sort of homemade puller, which is much more successful. But that's kind of not the point of this video. It's not about buying an expensive tool, it's about how to do this job if you don't have a puller at all, really, or even if you do, if this is just so corroded you can't get it out. Before I start pulling those oil seals out in a way that's going to make all the purists scream and holler and say never do this, I want to show you what an oil seal looks like and how it works, because I think it's important to know that, to know where you can do a bit of damage or where you can take risks and where you can't. I think it's not until you understand that you can really say yes or no, this technique's for me. This particular oil seal just came from an engineering shop down the road. It's not a Yamaha or a marine oil seal, but they're pretty similar. And to be honest with you, he actually argues it's better because it's a double lip oil seal. And what that means, if I can show you, is in here, there's a lip here and a lip here that seals against the prop shaft. So that has 2 times the sort of protection against oil getting past the prop shaft, whereas the original Yamaha part is only a single lip oil seal. So what it comes down to is that the propeller shaft turns inside here, and this outer surface presses against the casing. Now this outer surface doesn't move at all. If you have a little nick in the casing, it's got a big flat surface to seal against, and you can even use sealants against here. Might make it a little bit hard to get them out next time, but you can seal it against here. You can't use any sort of sealant in here, sorry, inside this inner diameter, because this is in constant motion at high RPM. And this is why, if in the process of trying to remove these oil seals, you put a scratch or a nick in your propeller shaft, that little scratch or nick will eat this oil seal really quickly. It'll scratch it, it'll take away a fraction of a millimeter, and that'll be enough for water to get in and oil to get out. So protecting the prop shaft itself is paramount. Protecting this outer bearing casing, or the outer casing here, is not so important. I'm not saying you want big gouges in it, but you have a large static surface sealing against that, and you have quite a fine dynamic surface doing its job against the prop shaft itself. So that's what an oil seal looks like. Now let's go and get the other ones out. One thing I forgot to say about these oil seals, this is this new one again, is that inside this rubberized coating is actually a metal part. One traditional way of doing this without the right tool is to drill a hole through these oil seals, put a self-tapping screw in, and then use those screws to pull the oil seal out. You can do that. One of the biggest risks is that as you're drilling, you nick the prop shaft itself. A technique people use to avoid that problem is holding a spanner, then running the drill bit here, and try and use the ring spanner to rest the drill bit against and guide it away from the prop shaft. But I personally don't even think that's particularly necessary. What I'm going to do is get a screwdriver between this casing and the oil seal and pry it away from the wall a little bit. This will definitely put little scratches in this casing. But as I said before, that's nowhere near as problematic as scratching the prop shaft itself. I'm going to use a variety of tools, from a standard flat blade screwdriver to this, which actually came as a part of a gasket removal kit, a little bit of a hook. In here you'll see the spring here that holds tension on the inner part against the moving shaft. But you can also start to see under this is the internal metal casing. You can see it doesn't take a whole lot to start pulling the rubber part of the oil seal out. I will confess at this stage the outer one's easier to get to because it's not as deep in the gearbox, but the oil seals themselves are identical. Now I've pulled more of the rubber away. You can see there's actually a bit of a gap here. This metal bit doesn't reach the prop shaft itself. It's not, otherwise it would scratch it. This part of the metal here is the casing. This slip here is a part of the oil seal, and this back plate's a part of the oil seal. So what I'm going to do is get a punch into the metal here, the metal back plate of this oil seal, and then lever it out against the casing here. You might do a tiny bit of damage to this casing here, but it's already got large grooves in it here where it's part of the manufacturing process. It's not going to affect how the new oil seal seals at all. You're not going to damage the prop shaft, and you're not going to damage the inner surface that the outside of the oil seals against. What I'm using for this is an old punch. Came down to a 2mm point, but it's just been ground to a sharper point. You may have to do this in a few places, because like all pressed in components, the squarer they come out, the better. You can see this starting to budge now. I'm just going to keep going round. Once you've got a hole in the back, something like this will let you pry it out pretty well. There we go. A lot of crusty corrosion in there, but that's the metal part out. I'll show you inside now. So inside there, what you can see now is the second oil seal that looks in much better condition than the original one, than the outer one. You can see there's a lot of that salty aluminium corrosion on the inside of that casing where the outer side of the oil seal presses against. So that's really going to need cleaning up, and you can see the prop shaft itself has got a fair bit of that dust fallen onto it. But what we're going to do now is pretty much the same process to get the inner one out. The inner one's a little bit trickier for no real reason other than it's a little bit deeper in. I'm going to start by using this pick to get the spring out. It only takes a mild amount of the pressure off, but it always feels like you're winning when you get that out. This back oil seal, before when we were punching as well, you're punching through the top oil seal into the back oil seal. This bottom oil seal, or the inner oil seal, is also hard against a metal surface, which actually helps in some ways but makes it a little bit harder in others. Once we get a little bit deeper and we're not so near this fragile edge of the casing here, I'm also a little bit happier to try and pry to wedge something in between that casing there and the outer edge of the oil seal and crush that inside a bit. And the reason I'm happy to do that bit more is that less chance of breaking this edge off because you're in a stronger part, and once again also because this surface isn't moving. So if you do put a bit of a groove in the surface here that water maybe can track past, you can put sealant against there. As before, I'm going to work my way around the seal a little bit. I don't want to focus on one corner and get it skew if I'm trying to pull it out as straight as possible. Hopefully I can show you what I've done in here now. This metal here is the oil seal levered this way away from the casing. Where you can see that little bit of oil leaking around the inner casing, that's because I've pushed the oil seal up. I've got a screwdriver between it and the casing and pushed it in a bit. I'm going to keep doing that all the way around. And I can get the lip away. That does two things. It obviously reduces the grip the oil seal has on this outer casing, but it also gives me a few sections where I can start trying to get some needle nose pliers in. The tip of the screwdriver's against the outer casing here, and the screwdriver itself's not touching the prop shaft or the splines here, so you're not risking damaging anything particularly sensitive. So even though this oil seal isn't out that much, I'm starting to be able to move it a bit in the housing, so I know it's actually unlocked as such. So I'm actually just using this hook now to find parts of it that I've deformed enough to get a grip on. And out it comes. There we go. And there it is. So this is the space now where the oil seals go. You can see the bearing at the very back of the prop shaft. That bearing is what the prop shaft spins on. Obviously that's bathed in oil from the gearbox. So it's the job of these oil seals to stop that oil getting out. But if I look around, what I mostly still see is lots of that salty corrosion and a bit of crusty oil. So what I really need to do is clean that up and get more gunk out rather than fill any particularly big gouges or any problems like that. Let's go outside for a bit. It's hot in there and it's getting dark too. What I've shown you, I guess, is one of those things where I have no problem showing people particular techniques that are not ideal. You know, they're not. As I said, the proper way to do this is to pull the bearing carrier out, get them out, absolutely no damage to the casing, no damage to the prop shaft. Having said all that about this being a bit of a hack technique and not the right way to go, I do think it's worth knowing. You know, there's a lot of things in the mechanical world that don't go to plan. People put videos up all the time where they show a real textbook technique and you go, well, that's not working for me. I don't have that tool. My outboard's really corroded, whatever. There's nothing wrong with knowing other possibilities, but you do need to understand the risks. With this one, I think the risks, if you're careful, aren't huge. I certainly wouldn't do it to a brand new outboard, that's for sure. But if it's old and you can't get it out and the gearbox is leaking, you've got to do it somehow. You know, you can't just leave it there and say, oh, I can't do it the right way, so I won't do it at all. What you're really looking to avoid is nicking the prop shaft, because if you do that, you'll damage the new seals for sure. You'll put it in, it'll last a couple of hours, and you'll have water in the gearbox and you're right back where you started. Damaging the outer casing is not such a big issue. If for whatever reason, and I don't think we've done that here at all, you take a significant gouge out of the inside of the metal there, use some sort of a sealant. It needs to be something appropriate, something like a master gasket sealant, that kind of thing. Something that's going to bond with the rubber of the oil seal and the metal casing, be compatible with aluminium, all that kind of thing. But go to your local store, find out what they've got. If you need to do that, you need to do that. Just don't get any on the inner surface because that's designed to move. But the inner surface is brand new because you're putting a brand new oil seal in, and if your prop shaft's undamaged, it'll be good. Just going to wash it out with a little bit of brake cleaner. And I'm actually just going to use this screwdriver to scrape a bit of the deposits out. Then a little bit of compressed air. So I've cleaned up the inside of the housing now, a little bit of brake cleaner, a bit of a wipe, not much, came out pretty easily. And it looks pretty good still. So this next thing I think is actually quite a cool tip. I was told this week by a guy called John at North Shore Bearings, Hornsby, Waitara way, if ever you're looking for a good place to get bearings, oil seals, all kind of things. And he was the guy that put me on to these oil seals. So I gave him this original Yamaha seal and said, can you give me more like this? He measured it up, they're actually written on it. It's got measurements. 22, 36, 6 is what it is. And that's when I got into this style. And that's also, he was also the one that pointed out this was a single lip seal and the ones he supplied were a double lip seal. But what he did say is that the spring inside these is not stainless steel. So a marine seal is always going to have a stainless steel ring inside it. He said you could use that on the oil side, but don't use it on the saltwater side. But what he was also able to supply was a swag of these nitrile O-rings. And he said, take your commonly available automotive, you know, land-based oil seal, good quality one, take that spring out, in its place, put the nitrile O-ring, and voila, ready for use in salt water. So this is what I'm going to try. When you're putting these oil seals in, it's a good idea just to get a bit of oil around the outside and the inside to make it easier to get them in. Once you've got them pressed in this far, you're going to need to find some sort of tube that you can use to knock them all the way in. I'm now going to do the same thing with this second oil seal. Fish the spring out. Pop one of these nitrile, I think they're nitrile anyway, O-rings in. Bit of oil on both sides. And there we go, 2 new oil seals in. Now what I'm going to do, I don't know the state of the drive shaft oil seal or the gear selector oil seal, but I'm going to put a pressure tester on this now and see whether these can hold pressure. snap a pressure gauge connector off. Nice move. So as you can see, this is holding pressure pretty well. So is this the right way to do this job? No. Is it a way that can do it potentially if you do it carefully? Yes. You'd do it this way if the bearing carrier was completely seized in. You would do it this way maybe if you needed to, you couldn't get to a shop and you didn't have the right tools to do it any other way. Be careful not to damage either parts really, the casing or the prop shaft, but I'd rather put a nick in the casing before I'd put a nick in the prop shaft any day. So keep that in mind when you're doing this job. This is the first time I've tried those nitrile rings inside a gearbox. Held pressure just fine. The guy who told me this tip works in an engineering company. All he does is sell bearings, O-rings, all that kind of stuff, so I have no reason to doubt it's a good way to go. And it certainly makes sense to get rid of those mild steel, or at least not stainless steel rings out of a oil seal if you're going to use it in a marine environment. So if you can't get an original O-ring for your manufacturer of outboard, then I think this is a really good way to go. If you can't find the part, or perhaps you find this is a lot cheaper than buying marine parts. Marine parts generally are expensive compared to parts you might buy at a normal sort of run-of-the-mill engineering store. So I think from a cost ground and an availability, it's just a good piece of information to file away should you need it one day. All right, well thanks again for watching. Hope you have a great weekend. Please rate, comment and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.